Have you ever had a neighbor who thought your belongings were theirs to take? Meet Linda, my entitled next-door neighbor who never respected boundaries. She had taken things before garden tools, my wheelbarrow, even caused chaos in my yard. But when she stole my honey, she crossed a line. Little did she know, nature had its own way of teaching her a lesson. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the sun cast a golden glow over my backyard, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the familiar, soothing hum of my bees. Tending to my hives had always been my escape, my passion, my livelihood. I had spent years carefully cultivating my little paradise, ensuring my bees were happy, healthy, and productive. But that morning, something was wrong. The buzzing wasn't the usual harmonious melody I had grown accustomed to. It was frantic, disoriented, like a warning signal I couldn't ignore. My heart sank as I hurried to my honey storage area, a small wooden shelf near the back of my yard where I kept fresh jars before taking them inside. The moment I saw it, my breath caught in my throat. The shelf was nearly empty. Jars that had been filled with golden, viscous honey just the day before were now gone. The only evidence of their existence was a few sticky smudges, a single overturned lid, and the faint aroma of my prized product lingering in the air. My mind raced. Had an animal gotten to them? No, that didn't make sense. There were no signs of claw marks or broken glass. This wasn't the work of a raccoon or a stray dog. And then, I saw her, Linda, standing by her shiny black SUV, casually loading my honey jars into the back seat like they were groceries she had purchased. No guilt, no hesitation. She didn't even try to sneak around. She was acting like this was perfectly normal, as if my hard-earned honey was hers to take. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. But what happened next made it worse. As she closed the car door, she absent-mindedly picked up one of the jars, wiped a smudge of honey off the lid with her sleeve, and, without a second thought, licked her finger. Then she smiled, as if she had just won some kind of prize. I stormed toward her, ready to unleash a verbal wrath she wouldn't forget, but before I could even get a word out, she turned, waved at me like we were old friends, and called out, "Thanks for the honey. It's amazing. You should really sell it at the farmer's market." Then, without waiting for a response, she slid into the driver's seat and backed out of her driveway, disappearing down the road. I stood there, dumbfounded. Sell it at the market? Sell it. She had just stolen my honey and was now giving me business advice as if she had done me a favor. The entitlement was staggering. The more I thought about it, the more my anger simmered. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. Linda knew exactly what she was doing. She had a long history of taking things that didn't belong to her. There was the time she borrowed my wheelbarrow and kept it for months, only returning it after I repeatedly asked for it back. And the time she helped herself to my garden shears, leaving them outside to rust when she was done. And, of course, the infamous party incident, where she hosted a backyard gathering that somehow ended with my gate broken and one of my beehives knocked over. That had been a nightmare, trying to calm down an entire colony of disturbed bees before they took off in a panic. But this was on a different level. My honey wasn't just some backyard hobby. It was my livelihood, my pride, my craft. It took months of careful tending to extract even a single jar. And she had stolen dozens without a second thought. I clenched my fists. A dozen different reactions flashed through my mind. Call the cops? Confront her in front of the whole neighborhood? Or, just maybe, let the bees handle it? The last option seemed extreme, but as I stood there, staring at the empty shelf, I felt a spark of something between justice and mischief ignite inside me. Linda had messed with the wrong beekeeper. Linda was predictable, greedy, entitled, and completely oblivious to consequences. If she had stolen my honey once, she'd do it again. And that was exactly what I was counting on. I had something special, honey infused with pheromones designed to guide lost bees back to their hive. Usually, it was a harmless tool to help my bees return home if they ever got disoriented. But today, it had a different purpose. That night, I prepared the trap. I placed one jar of this special honey on the exact shelf where she had stolen from before. I didn't bother hiding it. Linda never thought twice before taking what she wanted. If there was one thing I knew for sure, it was that greed makes people blind to danger. Sure enough, by noon the next day, she took the bait. From my upstairs window, I watched as she crept into my yard. She moved quickly but clumsily, as if she knew she was doing something wrong, but didn't care enough to be careful. She stuffed the jar into her oversized purse, barely looking around before hurrying off. I didn't even need to check. I knew exactly what she was planning. Linda loved to flaunt her ill-gotten gains, and I could already imagine her bragging to her brunch guests about her free honey. All I had to do now was wait. The next morning, I could hear Linda's voice carrying from her backyard. She was on the phone, speaking loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. "Oh, don't worry," she said, laughing. "I've got plenty of honey for brunch this time." I smirked. She had no idea what was coming. An hour later, the guests arrived. Linda had gone all out, lavish table settings, an overflowing fruit platter, and pastries drizzled with my honey. Everything looked picture perfect. At first, the brunch went smoothly. People ate, drank, and gossiped about their latest social dramas. But then it started. One bee, then another, then 5, then a dozen. At first, Linda lazily waved them away, unfazed. But within minutes, the situation escalated. The bees weren't just hovering around the food. They were drawn to something much stronger. Linda. The pheromones had worked better than I expected. Every bee in the area locked onto her, as if she were the queen of their hive. They landed on her hands, her shoulders, her expensive silk dress. She froze for a second, trying to maintain composure. Then, sheer panic set in. She let out a blood-curdling scream and began flailing wildly, knocking over drinks and sending plates crashing to the ground. Her guests jumped up, chairs toppled over, and the elegant brunch turned into an absolute disaster zone. One man tripped over a decorative plant and landed face-first in a fruit platter. Another guest dove into the pool like he was escaping an explosion. Napkins flew, mimosas spilled, and the once perfect backyard turned into a scene of pure chaos. But Linda? She was the main event. She sprinted across the yard, shrieking like a horror movie victim, arms flailing, hair flying. The bees followed relentlessly, swarming her with an intensity that was almost poetic. She bolted into her house and slammed the door behind her. Silence. I took a sip of my tea, watching the destruction unfold from my porch. It was beautiful. Just as I was beginning to enjoy the newfound peace, I found an envelope taped to my front door a few days later. The moment I saw the fancy embossed lettering, I knew it was trouble. Linda was suing me. For emotional distress. For negligence. For damages. I let out a slow, disbelieving laugh. The same woman who had trespassed on my property, stolen from me multiple times, and been the sole architect of her own disaster was now trying to drag me to court over a supposed bee attack. It was classic Linda. When she couldn't win, she whined. When she couldn't control a situation, she turned herself into the victim. But she had made one crucial mistake. She underestimated me. I called my lawyer, Lisa, a no-nonsense woman with the patience of a saint and the bite of a wolf. She listened to the details, sighed in a way that told me she wasn't even remotely surprised, and said exactly what I wanted to hear. She doesn't have a case. If anything, you do. A week later, I found myself in a small courtroom, watching as Linda, wearing an unnecessary neck brace, put on the performance of a lifetime. She sniffled, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, and recounted the horror she had endured. "They chased me," she whined. "I couldn't escape. It was terrifying." The judge, a middle-aged man who looked like he had endured his fair share of ridiculous cases, turned to me with a tired expression. "Do you have a response to these allegations?" I stood up, cleared my throat, and smiled politely. "Yes, Your Honor. I have security footage." The room went silent. Linda's face froze mid-fake sniffle. I handed the bailiff a USB drive, and moments later, the courtroom watched as crystal-clear footage showed Linda sneaking into my backyard, rummaging through my honey jars, and stealing them. Twice. The second clip showed her disastrous brunch, her shrieks filling the air as she ran in circles, knocking over tables while her guests fled in terror. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "Miss Linda," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "did you or did you not steal honey from the defendant?" Linda opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again before letting out a strangled noise somewhere between a cough and a whimper. "I'll take that as a yes," the judge said dryly. "And did the defendant at any point send the bees to attack you?" "Well, I mean, Miss Linda." She deflated like a balloon. "No, Your Honor." The judge shuffled some papers, then looked at her directly. "I'm dismissing this case." and I strongly advise you to stay off your neighbor's property unless you want to be dealing with real legal trouble. Linda turned redder than a sunburn, but, for once, didn't argue. She grabbed her ridiculous designer bag and stormed out of the courtroom. Lisa smirked at me. Well, that was satisfying. I laughed. Beyond satisfying. Lessons from the story. Respect other people's property. Just because you want something doesn't mean it belongs to you. If it's not yours, don't take it. Every action has consequences. If you think you can take advantage of others without repercussions, think again. Greed can blind people to danger. Linda was so consumed by her entitlement that she failed to see the trouble she was bringing upon herself. Meaningful message. In life, you can't just take without giving, and you can't exploit others without facing consequences. Justice comes in many forms, sometimes from nature itself. Be kind, be respectful, and remember that every action has a reaction. Personal perspective. I believe that some of the best lessons aren't taught by people, but by life itself. Linda refused to listen to reason, but she certainly got the message when she was chased by a swarm of bees. Sometimes, natural justice is the best punishment for greed and disrespect. If you enjoy stories about justice, morality, and valuable life lessons, hit like, subscribe to Story Precious, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. We bring you meaningful stories that will leave you with lessons to remember. Thank you for watching.